interesting coronary CT angiography cases and see why they were performed, what information we got out of it, and the whole concept of where coronary CT stands today. So, slowly in the imaging world, there's a transition from invasive to non-invasive modalities. And one such paradigm shift is the shift from invasive coronary angiography towards more imaging approach-based modalities such as CT and MRI. And even in the functional imaging, slowly the transition is from SPECT towards PET-CT. So these are all cases where the patient essentially presented with chest pain. So here's a middle-aged male presenting with atypical chest pain. What we're looking at is that the well-opacified left ventricle and a relatively less opacified right chambers of the heart. And the next image shows the three coronary arteries. And what we see is that in comparison to the LAD and the NCX, the RCA looks a little more expanded. It looks relatively hypodense. And what it implies is that it is an RCA thrombus. And it is an acute thrombus because the vessel is quite...
I think this thing is not working.
Is this better now?
Yeah.
Sorry. So, this is a case of, here the reformatted images show it all the more better, that the proximal RCA is opacified, but the mid and distal segments of the RCA are not opacified. This is a case of acute thrombosis of the coronary artery presenting as acute chest pain. So the number one indication of coronary CT angiography is to detect cases of coronary artery disease. What we can say is both qualitatively and quantitatively how much the vessel is diseased. We can comment on what types of plaques are there, whether they are calcific plaques, soft plaques, mixed plaques, whether they are causing vessel wall remodeling, whether it is positive or negative vessel wall remodeling, and quantify the stenosis. We can give percentage stenosis in terms of whether it is mild, moderate or severe, whether there is near complete or complete occlusion. And of late, CT is also used to quantify the amount of calcium. We use a system called as Agatston calcium scoring, which tells how much of calcium is present in the coronary arteries. And based on that, we can actually proceed to even comment on the diagnostic quality of the CT examination. For example, if we have an Agatston score of more than 700, the density of calcium is going to be so high that the luminal assessment is not going to be very accurate. But what it implies is that it is a badly diseased coronary circulation. Again, some volume reformatted images which shows dilated proximal right coronary artery with absence of contrast distally. Now this is yet another patient with... Am I audible as such?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll continue. So this is yet another patient who had right-sided chest pain. Chest radiograph demonstrates that he has dextrocardia. But then the physician asked for a coronary angiogram to see if there is any coronary artery disease. So what do we see here? Coronary circulation per se was normal apart from its abnormal situs, but we see lingular atelectasis. Okay, because given the altered anatomy, we see consolidation atelectasis in the lingula. So the idea of doing coronary CT angiography here is that the anatomy that it includes, we are not just excluding the cardiac and the coronary causes, but also the extra cardiac anatomy that is involved. So it may be a lung consolidation, it may be distal esophagitis or reflux esophagitis which gets picked up by CT. It could also pick up other pleuritic causes of chest pain, be it osteochondritis of the ribs or some kind of a chest wall pathology, sometimes breast nodules or fibrocystic disease which may be giving rise to chest pain. So any cause of atypical chest pain where the cardiac and the coronary structures are cleared, and we can pick up the extra cardiac causes of chest pain. Now, here's another case. Again, patient presented with chest pain. There are 3 images on this. So, anybody knows the finding? This is 1, 2, and 3.
Al-Kappa.
No. So while the focus is really on the coronaries, apart from the fact that this patient had a deceased LAD with a small saccular aneurysm here in the proximal LAD that we see, but the more important finding in this patient was these filling defects in the pulmonary arteries. So while the clinical concern was for ruling out coronary artery disease, we see multiple defects here in pulmonary arteries. So this is a case of pulmonary thromboembolism. So although the suspicion was for ruling out a coronary cause of chest pain, this patient turned out to have bilateral pulmonary thromboembolism. So here's the concept now that's coming for coronary CT, that is triple rule out. So what a triple rule out does is, in the same cardiac phase of acquisition, we can rule out coronary syndrome, we can rule out aortic dissection, and we can rule out pulmonary thromboembolism. So it's 3 birds at one shot. And here's the case 4. Again, this was a coronary CT that was asked for atypical chest pain. What we see is an anomalous course of the left coronary artery, which is following a retro-aortic course. Apparently, this is the most common anomaly of the coronary arteries that is found. Now, many a time the coronary angiogram per se may be negative, but for its anomalous origins or course or termination of the coronary arteries. Now, it is important to pick up some of these anomalies because, for example, a malignant course of the coronary artery between the aorta and pulmonary artery can cause sudden cardiac death. So, CT coronary angiography not only helps detect this disease, but also anomalous nature of these coronary arteries that needs to be picked up. So, overall, to conclude, CT coronary angiography, it's good to pick up the calcium load in the coronary arteries. It helps to qualify and quantify the amount of disease that is present. Extra cardiac structures can be evaluated. It's not just diseased coronary arteries, but also anomalous anatomy that can be picked up and defined. So that's all.
Dr. Jayadita, how versus pulmonary angiography?
When we do a triple rule out, we are trying to evaluate both the circulations. So it's going to be a longer breath hold, slightly higher contrast, and then we try to acquire both the circulations in one go. And we are going to include the lung fields as much as possible. So when we do a cardiac CT, it's going to be focused just on the heart and some of the lung is included. Whereas when we do a triple rollout, we do it right from the aortic arch up to the diaphragm and the complete chest.
So the doctor has to write triple. So
Yes.
if I put an order, I should put triple.
Yes, yes. It needs to be done. And another thing that I'd like to say, when a patient is coming for a post-CABG graft, so it's very important for radiologists to know what grafts and what stent was done, how old it is, because we are going to be evaluating restenosis and how many vessels were stented, and we need to know what was done. So I really request that whenever you're sending in requests for post-CABG patients, that as much clinical info be provided to us.
One more, Dr. Jayadita, before you go. Request Dr. Surita to give us a presentation.
You can smell the while you're working.
Now I request Dr. Deepak to come and present. Yeah, good. This works. Good evening, everybody. Frankly, expected that a little more number of people would be there for the meeting. We'll have a brief case presentation and discuss about some points regarding management of acute coronary syndrome, which is a burning topic with Southeast Asians, especially Indians, bearing the brunt of heart attacks and acute coronary syndromes. So this is basically a gentleman, 50-year-old, who presented with some mild breathlessness, sweating and nausea, dull pain over the last 1 hour, following a heavy dinner, worsened in the last 15 minutes, radiating to the left shoulder, no injection with antacid, ranitidine. This is a common scenario. Many people come with a symptom like this. We may treat with pantoprazole, we may treat with ranitidine, and he has sternal discomfort going to the shoulder and worsening in the last 15 minutes. No history of any exercise-induced pain in the form of exertional angina. No chest pain at rest in the past. Fever, cough, with or without hemoptysis, trauma or palpitations. So that's the basic history. In the past history, there is an occasional chest burn following heavy or spicy meals, which is not uncommon in any of us. No history of diabetes or hypertension. No regular health checkups. Last visit was 2 to 3 years ago to a doctor. BP was found to be slightly high, not followed up. Father had hypertension and died of a stroke. He's in a stressful job. He's a smoker, social drinker, irregular eating habits. Diet includes a lot of not so heart-friendly diet. He's overweight, anxious, pulse is 98, BP is 150 by 96, BMI is slightly on the higher side. On examination, nothing much significant. It all looks normal. Most of the acute coronary syndrome which come to us on examination are normal, apart from the look of anxiety and maybe a little bit of tachycardia. Most of them are normal, unless they have ended up in a mechanical complication of MI like mitral regurgitation or VSD, which is quite rare. Most of them are normal on examination. Some of them may have a few basal crepitations due to pulmonary edema. Other than that, we usually don't find anything on systemic examination. So at this point, reflux, acute myocardial infarction, stable, unstable angina, acute aortic syndromes like dissection or rupture, coronary vasospasm, esophageal spasm, all of these come to our mind. Plus, of course, the most common musculoskeletal chest pains and things like that. So we look at the ECG, which I think should be the first test in such a patient coming with a history. Dr. Siddharth, can you comment on the ECG?
Is ST depression in V3, V4 and V5 to more than 2 millimeters.
So there is a significant horizontal and lead V5, even downsloping ST depression, which is quite typical. Even in lead 1 and AVL, if you see, there is a little bit of the sagging of the ST segment. So the suggested investigations, ECG has already been done. It shows ST disabling depressions, as you already told. ABG looks pretty much okay. Electrolytes, creatinine, urea, all look okay. Lipid profile is severely deranged. CBC is slightly on the higher side. X-ray is normal. The echo, that shows a normal ejection fraction. What do you think should be the next investigation?
Cardiac enzymes.
So cardiac enzymes have been done. troponin is 0.2 and CPKB is 2.5. Both are essentially normal, which is again a very common scenario. Somebody comes with a typical ischemic chest pain. ECG shows all the ischemic changes, but then the TROP-T and the CPKB is normal because essentially he is not infarcted. He is just in that phase of unstable angina, probably going on to become a non-ST elevation or an ST elevation MI, we don't know. But as of now, he has unstable angina. So some points to be considered when we are investigating for acute coronary syndrome. The most important test is the ECG, should be done as soon as possible. They say that 10 minutes is the maximum limit within which you should perform an ECG, and it should be read by an expert who can analyze the ECG and come to a conclusion. Cardiac troponins are important for risk stratification. They can be detected as early as 2 hours and as late as 8 to 12 hours. It's not fixed depending on the degree of myocardial damage. It is roughly around 4 to 6 hours, but it can be as less as 2 hours it may appear, and it may not appear up to 12 hours also. And it usually persists up to 2 weeks when significantly elevated. CKMB has gone little out of favor because it elevates a little later by 6 to 8 hours and it persists only for 2 to 3 days. So, but it is still important because when somebody reinfarcts, somebody comes with an MI, we thrombolize and then they reinfarct, or we have done a bypass surgery and then in the post-operative period they have had an infarct. CKMB is useful in such circumstances because a re-elevation happening after say 3 to 4 days is an important sign of reinfarction.
So should we also get a C-reactive protein done at this stage?
C-reactive protein is really non-specific. Anybody with a fever, anybody with any sort of
doesn't have
infection
fever,
can also
so
have it elevated. So if it comes positive, we really don't know what it is. If it comes negative,
with the
again,
neutrophils being normal, if it doesn't have fever and if the C-reactive protein comes high, so
may not mean anything. In acute coronary syndrome diagnosis, CRP doesn't have any role. CRP is an important marker of aggressive atherosclerosis in the body generally, because atherosclerosis is now regarded as an inflammatory process. Other than that, it does not have
it means that if it comes positive and if it doesn't have any other reasons for having a C-reactive protein raised,
we cannot make out at
so
that
it would
point.
be branded as a
any
high
other
risk
reason.
patient. To brand him as a high risk patient.
No, a stable atherosclerotic patient can also have HSCRP high.
And it takes time to come back. So you won't get it right away.
No, and so many of the patients without acute
It's
coronary
unstable.
syndrome can also have a positive CRP.
But the ECG changes with the ECG changes.
Just the presence of atherosclerosis in the body can make the CRP be elevated. It doesn't necessarily mean acute coronary syndrome. So, come to a working diagnosis based on the history and ECG, do a cardiac biomarker, and come to a final diagnosis. The cardiac biomarker being negative does not rule out acute coronary syndrome. This is very important because most of the acute coronary syndromes can be unstable angina where there is no infarction. So it could be just unstable angina. So the patient has typical ischemic pain, and if ECG changes are there suggestive of ischemia, it is still an acute coronary syndrome but without enzyme elevation, in which case it will be an unstable angina. The other important thing is to do a lipid profile within 24 hours of admission. Within 24 hours, because beyond 24 hours there is an increase in the level of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and the lipid profiles can get lower than what they normally are. So it would not be reflective of actual levels. So if it is not done within 24 hours, it should be done after 3 weeks of an acute coronary syndrome. So this is basically to recapitulate: a 50-year-old male with chest pain, which is suggestive of ischemia, ECG suggestive of changes, and cardiac markers which are negative, with a strong family history and dyslipidemia and all that, with a high risk lifestyle which is sedentary and stressful. So the diagnosis is unstable angina. So how do we diagnose acute coronary syndrome is the question. The most important thing is of course the symptom, which is chest discomfort. It could be jaw discomfort, it could be just a heaviness in the chest, it could be just breathlessness, increasing angina lasting more than 20 minutes, radiating to arm, jaw or back. It may or may not be associated with other symptoms like nausea, vomiting, sweating, being short of breath. Diabetics, elderly and women can have atypical symptoms or no symptoms. This is very important. So whenever somebody comes and they're really not able to pinpoint what they're feeling, it is always better to rule out an acute coronary syndrome, especially elderly people coming with confusion, coming with just feeling fatigue, syncope and things like that. You should have a very high index of suspicion. ECG should be done within 10 minutes. You should look for T-wave inversions more than 1 millimeter, ST segment depression more than half a millimeter, and ST segment elevation more than 1 millimeter, which are criteria for ischemia, which indicate myocardial damage. So this is an example of an ECG where there is ST segment elevation. ST segment elevation should not be missed at any cost. If a patient has come with the ECG at the beginning, which is normal, it should always be repeated after half an hour and then again after 1 hour intervals to see if there is any serial changes. Sometimes an initial ECG, even in an ST elevation MI, can be normal in up to 5 to 10% cases. In 90% of the cases, the ECG shows at presentation, but in 5 to 10%, an initial ECG can be normal. So serial ECGs are important, as well as serial troponins and CPKMB. If one initial troponin has come negative, it doesn't rule out an acute coronary syndrome. If the patient has suggestive symptoms and some ECG changes, the troponin should be repeated after 4 hours. And if that is also negative, then we can rule out an acute coronary, myocardial damage happening. That still doesn't rule out unstable angina, in which case the patient needs admission and further treatment. So elevated troponin or CPKMB basically confirms that there is myocardial necrosis of some degree. So then we can classify the patient as having a non-ST elevation or a ST elevation MI based on the ECG findings. And I would like to repeat that again, that a negative troponin doesn't mean the hospitalization is not required. If ischemic symptoms are there, if ECG changes are there, they still would need admission and further risk stratification and treatment. So how would we manage this patient? What is the need to stratify the risk, and how do we do that? And what risk this patient is at? There are various modalities of evaluating risk in a patient coming with MI. ST elevation MI per se, the broad thing is that if there is ST elevation MI, all these patients fall into high risk, irrespective of anything else. The bigger the infarct, bigger the risk. Smaller the infarct, smaller the risk, but all ST elevation MIs are risky. These patients need hospitalization and reperfusion in the form of thrombolysis or a primary angioplasty. Inferior MIs per se are slightly better off than antrewall MIs because the area of myocardium damage is less. Antrewall MIs have a worse prognosis because the area of myocardium damage is very big. And more elderly the patient, more unstable the patient, higher the risk. This is the general rule. Coming to non-ST elevation MI and unstable angina, there are various scoring systems. But broadly speaking, if somebody has ongoing chest pain, which is not responding to a dose of sublingual nitroglycerin, if somebody has deep ST depressions more than 2 millimeters in 2-3 leads, if they have any sort of LV dysfunction on echo, if they have elevation of troponins or CPKMB, all these are high risk. Any of these are present, they fall under high risk. There are some scoring systems which we can follow, like there is a TIMI risk model given here, depending on age, number of risk factors, known coronary artery disease, acute coronary syndrome happening despite aspirin use, and presenting with severe angina, elevated cardiac markers, ST deviation more than 0.05 millivolt. So the risk adds up, and you can see in the graph below that the higher the number of points, the mortality and morbidity goes on increasing. So these are some of the, there is also a gray score, but broadly we have to remember that more severe and ongoing the chest pain, more severe the ECG changes, the positivity of the markers, these are the main things on which we should depend upon. And when we follow this general rule, we see that most of these risk scores are also looking at similar things. And of course, if somebody has already undergone an angioplasty in the past, or if they've already undergone a bypass surgery in the past and they come with chest pain and ECG changes, they automatically fall into a higher risk category. And they should be treated as high risk acute coronary syndromes. So immediate steps include hospitalization, sublingual nitroglycerin, enoxaparin or heparin, whichever you are convenient with, chewable aspirin. Along with aspirin, an additional dose of oral antiplatelet agent like clopidogrel or ticagrelor or prasugrel should be given depending on the clinical situation. But in a multi-speciality clinic like ours, I feel clopidogrel is the easier one to be given, because we are all familiar with the dosage of 300 to 600 milligram loading dose and aspirin. Ticagrelor and prasugrel can be given in cardiac hospitals when an angioplasty is being planned as a part of loading with these drugs before the procedure. Rosuvastatin or atorvastatin, one of the statins have to be given, and there are some trials which have shown that loading with a high dose statin when a patient presents with acute chest pain and acute coronary syndrome brings down the level of inflammatory markers, and these patients are shown to perform better in the long run. Metoprolol should be given depending on the heart rate and blood pressure if the patient is not in bad pulmonary edema, and the patient should be stabilized. So in this general approach, if there are any missing drugs, one thing missing is an AC inhibitor. AC inhibitor should be generally added to all patients with acute coronary syndrome, especially those who have diabetes, who have hypertension, and people who have LV dysfunction of any degree. They should receive AC inhibitors. And statins, again, as I told, there is a role for a high dose statin in acute coronary syndrome to bring down the inflammatory marker level and stabilize the patient.
Can you give an ACE inhibitor without checking the kidney function?
Yes, one dose doesn't really harm.
What about ARBs?
ARBs also. But in acute coronary syndrome, acute MI situation, there is no trial with ARBs. In secondary prevention, there is some evidence, but in acute coronary syndromes and following acute coronary syndrome, only AC inhibitors have been shown to have mortality benefit. So these are some of the trials, SAVE, AIR and TRACE, where AC inhibitor has been compared with placebo, and cumulative death, readmission, reinfarction has been studied, and it has been found that patients who have received AC inhibitor in the acute coronary syndrome intra-hospital period or the post-acute coronary syndrome period fare better than those not receiving the AC inhibitor. Again, this is again some of the graphs showing earlier the statin is initiated, the more the benefit in acute coronary syndrome. As I told, it brings down the inflammatory marker levels, and overall inflammation is reduced, and there is some sort of plaque stabilization beginning to happen once you give statins early in acute coronary syndrome. So these are some of the guidelines. As I told, AC inhibitors have to be given within 24 hours of an acute coronary syndrome, especially if there is pulmonary congestion or if there is any LV dysfunction, and patients who have diabetes or hypertension. Statins have to be given irrespective of LDL cholesterol or total cholesterol levels to all patients with acute coronary syndrome. Some of the patients do ask us that my cholesterol level is normal, and how come I have been getting 40 milligram of atorvastatin or 20 milligram of rosuvastatin? So the simple way to put to them is, see, your blood levels may be normal, but the tissue levels are not. Basically meaning that there is cholesterol deposits within the blood vessels. There is plaque burden because of which the acute coronary syndrome has happened in the first place. So all patients of ACS should have a statin before discharge, and they should be followed up with their LDL levels and total cholesterol levels. And most of these patients will require lifelong statins. There is no second question about that. So what is the LDL goal recommended following ACS? The latest recommendation says that lower the better. You should try to keep the LDL cholesterol below 70. They have had some natural history trials in some of these African tribes, and they have been known to have the lowest acute coronary syndrome levels world over, and their LDLs are found in the range of 20-30, and they are basically people living in forests, mostly living on unrefined, naturally available food, and they don't eat any of the junk what we consume. So, and they have a lowest ACS rates. So, depending based on that and based on several other studies, they have come to this number of less than 70. So, any patient who has had an acute coronary syndrome, people who are smokers, people who have had previous revascularization, this should be the agreed level. For others, it can be less than 100. But for patients who have had ACS, it is less than 70. So depending on, and the other thing is, what is the dose of statin we give? Generally people give 10 milligrams, 5 milligrams, 20 milligrams. it varies. But most of the trials which have analyzed mortality, morbidity benefit have found that 40 to 80 milligram of atorvastatin or 20 to 40 milligram of rosuvastatin is what gives mortality benefit. So even though the numbers are lower, you need to aim at a higher dose, the optimal dose which has been used in these trials, especially for post-ACS patients. You have to give a higher dose, and what is recommended is if the patient cannot take a higher dose for longer periods, you give them at least for a month to 3 months and then maintain them on half the dose of that. So you can give 80 milligrams of atorvastatin or 40 milligrams of rosuvastatin for 3 months and then bring it down to 40 or 20 depending on the agent we are using. So this is one of the trials, LUNAR trial, in which rosuvastatin was given within 48 hours of acute coronary syndrome, which led to greater reduction in LDL cholesterol levels compared with atorvastatin. Atorvastatin and rosuvastatin are similar, but some trials have found that the HDL levels are slightly better off in patients on rosuvastatin. When we give 80 milligrams of atorvastatin, we have seen that the HDL level also comes down along with the LDL. LDL was 180, came down to 90, and the HDL, which was 45, comes down to 25. So this significant decrease in HDL can be bad because that is a good cholesterol. And some trials have found that Jupiter trial and LUNAR trial have found that the HDL levels are better maintained with rosuvastatin. So there is a case for rosuvastatin to be used over atorvastatin. Coming to the burning question, whether you do an early invasive strategy by doing an angiogram and angioplasty or follow a conservative strategy, what is best? The evidence in favor of conservative strategy is with the VANQUISH trial, but most of the other trials have found that an invasive strategy is favored. The guidelines regarding exercise tolerance test or doing a diagnostic angiography, what should be done? As I told, anybody falling in the high risk category, like elevated enzymes, significant ST deviations, any ST elevation MI, anybody having LV dysfunction, anybody having any of the mechanical complications like mitral regurgitations or VSD, these patients and people who have in the past already undergone an angioplasty or a bypass surgery, these people should be undergoing an angiogram and angioplasty straight away. There is no doubt about those things. People who have had a negative enzyme, ECG changes have not been very dramatic. The chest pain was there, but there was no ongoing ischemia or ongoing angina on presentation. People who have had a normal LV function, no past history of revascularization like angioplasty or bypass surgery, can undergo an exercise tolerance test or undergo a thallium study to assess for inducible ischemia. And if they are found to have any high risk criteria on these tests, they can undergo an angiogram and an angioplasty. But any ST elevation MI, the first preferred choice is to do a primary angioplasty. And any other high risk acute coronary syndrome, as the things I mentioned are there, like positive enzymes and drastic ECG changes, ongoing ischemia, should undergo an angiogram and angioplasty, because the degree of myocardial damage is more and more myocardium is at risk. So you cannot wait for them to stabilize and come for an angiogram or an angioplasty, because the best way to stabilize these kind of high risk patients is to do a revascularization immediately and promptly, depending on the anatomy you find on an angiogram. If it is a single or a double vessel disease, you can do a culprit vessel angioplasty and tackle the other lesion later. If it is a triple vessel or a left main lesion, then you may send them after stabilizing for a bypass surgery. Depending on the coronary anatomy, you can do that. So these are some of the recommendations which are given, broad guidelines how you should do. Within 2 hours in patients with refractory angina. Somebody has ongoing angina, there is no point waiting for them to stabilize. The only way they will stabilize is by suffering a cardiac arrest or by undergoing an angioplasty. So you choose the angioplasty. Within 24 hours, for those having a higher risk score, more than one high risk criteria and things like that. In less than 72 hours, if only one high risk criteria is there or recurrent symptoms are there, and in low risk patients it is not recommended according to the European Society. The American Society has slightly different things, but generally we look at how much myocardium damage would have happened based on the clinical symptoms, ECG, enzymes, echo, And if there is a suspicion of more myocardial damage, we go for an early invasive strategy. If there is evidence of less myocardial damage or no myocardial damage, we can go towards conservative strategy. But then there may be other things like very elderly people not able to undergo revascularization procedures, who may be suffering from comorbidities and things like that, where the procedure itself may be risky. There again you may fall back for a conservative option. So this patient finally underwent a coronary angiogram. The left coronary artery, that is the LAD, had a 70% proximal and 95% mid stenosis. He underwent a angioplasty through the radial approach, and drug-eluting stent was placed in the LAD. So he was discharged on therapeutic lifestyle changes, which he is expected to follow. Dual antiplatelet therapy with aspirin and another oral antiplatelet agent like ticagrelor or prasugrel or clopidogrel, with a statin, rosuvastatin 20 mg, metoprolol, ramipril, and a sustained release nitroglycerin twice daily. I just say a few lines on secondary prevention. Long-term challenges after doing a angioplasty. One of the main challenges after you do an angioplasty is lifestyle. Most of these patients will adhere to a lifestyle for a month, 2-3 months, and after that they will go back to their original lifestyle. So preventing them to go back into their original sedentary lifestyle, going back to smoking and things like that is the most important thing. The problems what we face post PCI are recurrent ischemia, which may be because of restenosis or progression of disease or a new disease arising elsewhere. Recurrent chest pain, which again could be one of the reasons mentioned above, or some other reason for which you need to evaluate. Restenosis, when we use bare metal stents, it was very common, 25 to 30%, but now with the use of drug-eluting stents, it has become less than 5 to 10%. Patients presenting with angina between 3 to 6 months, I would say, will be candidates who might have developed restenosis. If angina or recurrent chest pain occurs after 6 months, it is usually a new lesion coming up. Any patient post PCI presenting with ST elevation MI or any acute ischemia should always think about acute stent thrombosis. Some of these people might have stopped their dual antiplatelet drugs, or some problem might have been there during the initial procedure, which might have led to the stent thrombosis. Post 6 months, it may be progression of disease in the same vessel or in a different vessel. So these are the challenges. So how do we prevent most of this? One is adherence to medication. Dual antiplatelet therapy should be continued for a minimum period of 1 year without stopping. Many of our patients come back with some other unrelated surgery and need to stop dual antiplatelet drugs and things like that. The only place for stopping dual antiplatelet therapy post angioplasty is when they come with an intracranial bleed or any life-threatening bleed. If there is any elective surgery happening, if it is possible to postpone to beyond 1 year of angioplasty, it is better to do that. If something has to be done, then it has to be done with dual antiplatelet therapy going on, accepting the small risk of bleeding. At any point of time, for an elective surgery, dual antiplatelet therapy should not be stopped within 1 year of an angioplasty. So that is very important. Beta blockers, ACE inhibitors,
If he has a trauma, how do we take care of? If he has a trauma,
if the trauma is something producing life-threatening bleed and things like that, then you may have to withhold it for a day or two and restart as soon as possible, or at least cover him with heparin during the period.
What about dental procedures?
Dental procedures can be done without stopping the antiplatelet.
Should be 1 or 2 days of stopping the this thing antiplatelet? Would it harm?
Yes.
One or two.
It can. There have been patients where just
they come with external injury, head injury, but internal scan shows
then there should be no need to stop it. Usually
Just
these
use the
bleeds which
patient.
happen will stabilize slightly later than what normally would happen. And dental bleeds also happen for a slightly longer duration than normal, but that should be okay. They can be observed in the post-procedure period, and that should be all. We have done extensive dental procedures in people who have been on antiplatelet drugs. And it also depends on the surgeon's comfort level. Some surgeons are okay operating with a dual antiplatelet on also. But yeah, if there is any life-threatening bleed, you have to stop. There is no other option. Suppose somebody develops hematemesis requiring transfusion, or intestinal bleed, or intracranial bleed, or intraocular bleed, you have to stop.
But how, after stopping, how long does it take for the platelet function to return to normal?
5 to 6 days.
So by that time you would have like.
You have to manage them with platelet transfusions, whatever is required, blood transfusions. But that is a high risk period. Whenever the patient is off antiplatelets within 1 year of angioplasty, and for some reason it has to be stopped, there is a high risk of myocardial infarction. There is a high risk of acute coronary syndrome happening because of stent thrombosis. And stent thrombosis, unfortunately, is a high risk event, and which has got a mortality of more than 50%. It's more dangerous than acute MI happening in a normal vessel. So control of ischemic symptoms can be done with nitrates, beta blockers, and calcium channel blockers. Control of risk factors is very important, including hypertension, smoking, dyslipidemia. Sedentary lifestyle should be addressed, and treatment of diabetes mellitus to keep the sugars controlled. So basically the same thing in secondary prevention. Few words about dual antiplatelet drugs. As I told, aspirin has to be given in all patients, and a second second antiplatelet agent like clopidogrel, ticagrelor, or prasugrel can be given. Prasugrel has a few limitations. It is very potent and can cause high risk of bleeding. Should not be given in patients older than 75 years, weight less than 55 kilos, history of stroke and all that. Ticagrelor is a better agent, again more potent than clopidogrel. It can be used in the acute coronary syndromes as well as before angioplasty and after angioplasty. Aspirin has to be given indefinitely in all patients. The other antiplatelet drug can be stopped after 1 year, is the recommendation. But if there is no contraindication, it can be continued lifelong, especially in case of clopidogrel. Beta blockers again have to be given if there are no contraindications like bradycardia, hypotension, or heart failure like Fabry edema. Once the patient is stabilized, even in heart failure, beta blockers have to be reinstituted. Because one of the important role is there is a significant reduction of sudden cardiac death when we use beta blockers in the post-ACS period. So both recommendations concur here that all patients should receive beta blockers. So metoprolol in post-MI trials have shown that it reduces ventricular fibrillation and sudden cardiac death. Role of nitrates. This is very important. A lot of patients, once they are branded as coronary artery disease patients, have been put on long-acting nitrates. One thing important to remember is nitrates do not per se have any mortality benefit. It is only for symptomatic treatment. So if somebody has undergone revascularization in the form of a bypass surgery or angioplasty and they don't have any more angina, it can be stopped. And stopping nitrate in a patient who has been revascularized is not an issue. It is only in patients who are having angina, who are having symptoms, is when we have to use nitrates. And any of the agents are equally good, depends on the pharmacokinetics, how you dose them and all that. Some of the side effects include heaviness in the head and headache, which have to be tackled. Only thing is they reduce angina and gives some symptomatic benefit. So this patient had a follow-up after 6 weeks. He was doing well. His LDL has come down to 130. Total cholesterol still at 200. He had one more angioplasty because he had 2 lesions in the LAD, of which one was stented at the first event and the second one was done in the follow-up. This is important. One of the things when we do an angiogram for an acute coronary syndrome, we may find that more than one vessel is diseased. The general approach is to tackle the one which is the culprit, which has the thrombus burden, which is the tightest lesion. We identify that as the culprit vessel, and that is tackled and stented, and the other lesions are usually not touched during the acute intervention because in the acute scenario the inflammatory markers are high. It is a thrombotic environment, so the more the number of stents you put in, higher risk of stent thrombosis and events will be there. So if the patient is stable after the culprit angioplasty, you should leave them alone, follow them up after 6 to 8 weeks and do the remaining lesions later. So the key takeaway points would be early invasive management leads to better outcomes. Intensive lipid management has favorable prognostic impact. Secondary prevention using dual antiplatelet drugs, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors and statins is important. These 4 drugs have to be there in all patients. Dual antiplatelet, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors and statins. And without writing these 4, without contraindications is not good in favor of the patient. These 4 have to be there in all patients who have had ACS. After PCI, target LDL is below 70 in order to reduce recurrence of events. And the vast majority of patients may not achieve this target, so you need to use high dose of statins which are recommended in trials. Rosuvastatin that way has a slight edge over other because it has better LDL reduction compared to atorvastatin, simvastatin. Thank you.
Any role of IV beta blockers, Dr. Deepak, in acute MI?
IV beta blockers do have a role, but only thing is we have to be careful about the blood pressure monitoring and the heart rate response. In trials, there is a trial called COMET ACS which was done in China, and it found that IV beta blockers have a definite role in reducing the incidence of VT and VF in the post-ACS period. The only drawback is significant bradycardia and significant hypotension can happen, in which case you need to be careful. And ideally, any patient who looks, who seems to have pulmonary congestion or elevated JVP and things like that should not be given IV beta blockers. Meaning to say that frank heart failure symptoms, acute heart failure symptoms are there, IV beta blockers should be avoided.
So how do you, in Prinzmetal angina, we should not use beta blockers, right?
Prinzmetal angina, luckily, is a rare entity. And it
So how do we know that?
presents with transient ST elevations. So when you do second ECG, you may not find that ST elevation being there. And
So unstable angina could have been also on Prinzmetal angina.
yeah. So in when there is ST elevation and you see a patient with chest pain, if you do an echocardiogram, Prinzmetal's angina will not usually have regional wall motion abnormality, whereas an ST elevation myocardial infarction will have a regional wall motion abnormality. That area of the heart muscle does not move. So that is one way in which practically you can differentiate. The other thing is it is only transient ST elevation. It may just happen in few seconds and come back to normal. And relief of pain also would be prompt with Prinzmetal angina. And one thing is there, even in Prinzmetal angina, if you just give 1 dose of beta blocker, nothing will happen. It is only that those patients should not be put on chronic treatment with beta blockers. Calcium channel blockers and nitrates are preferred.
How soon can you do an angioplasty, that is as quickly as you can?
Yeah.
But how long can you wait
After,
after an acute coronary?
as I told, there are some criteria which they have told. If somebody has ongoing chest pain, if somebody has hemodynamic instability in the form of bradycardia or tachycardia, hypotension, and echo shows that the ejection fraction is less, basically showing that there is a large area of myocardium at risk, you need to do it as soon as possible. In patients who do not have these things, you can probably wait for a few hours, stabilize the patient and then do. In patients who do not have any of the features can be risk stratified other ways by doing a TMT or a thallium study at a later date. So basically we are looking at how much myocardium is at risk and how unstable the patient is.
So if the patient who has come from outside, he had a chest pain yesterday, so he didn't find anything, he came, today he came. So you know already the MI is done and this thing, myocardium is already damaged, more than 24 hours is already passed.
Yeah.
So would you take him for PCI or?
24 hours have already passed and the patient doesn't have ongoing chest pain. You should do a thallium study in those patients to assess the viability, ideally.
So no angioplasty, you don't angiogram
24 hours
also?
it does not have a role actually. If the infarction has already happened, the patient doesn't have any more ongoing ischemia, that means that the infarct has already settled in. Ideally, such a patient should undergo a thallium study to look for viability, and if viability is preserved, do an angiogram.
If the infarct is expanding, so we will not know how
After
to
24 hours, it doesn't expand.
extending.
No. it
Then he'll
happens
be
in the
having
only
pain.
initial 6 to 12 hours.
So if he's having pain, then only you can take him for angioplasty. or-
Any evidence of hemodynamic instability, ongoing arrhythmias, electrical instability or mechanical instability, and chest pain. If these three things are there, even at 24 hours, you can do an angiogram and an angioplasty, because that means that there is more myocardium at risk. But if somebody has totally settled without pain, without any hemodynamic instability, they have just come, then there is not much of a role for doing an angioplasty.
Would it be correct to say that if there is pain, ongoing pain, it indicates that there is
Yes.
active
Definitely.
myocardial, viable
Definitely.
myocardium that can be
Definitely.
salvaged? So you just go ahead and do
Yes.
the procedure.
Because
Presence
recently
of-
we had a patient who was 33-year-old who came with chest pain, which was on and off for 15 days.
Right.
And it had become more in the previous 24 hours, and even when he came to the emergency, he was still having chest pain. ECG done showed Q waves in inferior leads with ST elevation. We went ahead, did an angiogram, there was an acute occlusion of RCA, we did the angioplasty. So sometimes what happens is, the infarct may not happen at once. You have something known as a stuttering infarct. There may be some thrombus formation which dissolves, opens up, patient feels some relief, then again it occludes, he has some chest pain. So there are some patients who come like that, and if the chest pain is ongoing, it is a definite indication to take them up for an angiogram and angioplasty. That is one of the indicators.
Presence of persistent ST elevation in the absence of chest pain, indicating an LV aneurysm kind of a situation, is that an indication for you to go ahead with an angiogram?
No. Lot of times ST elevations can persist because of, as you told, aneurysm formation. And the other thing is, if there has been scarring with areas of normal myocardium, you find persistent STs being there even after months of MI. That is not an indication.
What about asthmatics and beta blockers?
Asthmatics and beta blockers should not ideally give, especially if they have ongoing bronchospasm. There is a definite contraindication. But some asthmatics do tolerate it well, especially some of the agents like nebivolol and carvedilol. When we have given to patients, even with asthma, they have tolerated well.
They be
And-
fairly well tolerated.
Yeah, and COPD patients, in fact, tolerate it even better. Many COPD patients do not have any problem when you give beta blockers. If there is a strong indication to give a beta blocker in the form of LV dysfunction, in the form of post-acute coronary syndrome, and the patient is asthmatic or having COPD, you can give them beta blockers when they are in the hospital and observe them. If they do not develop any problem, you can continue. In fact, it is a good thing, and there has been a recent study in COPD which shows that when you give beta blockers, the mortality and morbidity reduces even in COPD patients, because the sympathetic drive comes down and the overall incidence of arrhythmic deaths is reduced even in COPD and cor pulmonale.
Is it because of cardiac selectivity?
No, any beta blocker has this thing of reducing sudden cardiac death, PTVF. And patients who have COPD, cor pulmonale, most of them die due to cardiac arrhythmias. And there is a role for beta blockers in these patients to prevent that.
Request Dr. Beliapar to. Thank you, sir, for the wonderful speech.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak, for an excellent presentation and for educating us.
I learned a lot.
Dr. Deepak,
One more.
Yeah.
One more.
You see, years of pediatrics. Yes, so this is all. So I'm just going to do a bunch of like little case scenarios in PD, you know, that we see. Oh, sorry. Just some cases seen and lessons learned, kind of in pediatric cardiology. So I know it's end of the day, so I shall zip through. This is case 1, 14-year-old male, fever and cough, chest pain, which is more on the supine position and relieved on sitting. No other real complaints. On exam, he had muffled heart sounds, no evidence of pulsus paradoxus, reduced air entry in his left lower zone. You're thinking maybe pericarditis. An echo actually over time showed this, which is a large effusion around the heart. ECG was within normal limits, ESR 63, CRP 60. So sputum for AFP negative, ruled out COX. LFT, kidney function test normal. Any other thoughts on this one?
Pneumatic.
Could be. And then lupus
Yep.
is the other thing. So RF was negative, ANA positive, and TDS DNA positive. So this child had SLE. And I think one of the lessons is that cardiac involvement can be the sole manifestation of SLE. You can get it without any of the butterfly rashes and without all the other symptoms, but just presenting purely as pericardial effusion. And 30% of SLEs actually have cardiac symptoms, myocarditis and so on, but just pericardial effusion can be, one has to kind of send off the ANA and rule out lupus in these cases. Case scenario 2, a 3-year-old, high-grade fever, 7 days, has conjunctivitis, lymphadenopathy, rash, Kawasaki. And very important to really diagnose this early, because with Kawasaki disease, the fever goes away, but the aneurysms remain. And this is a short axis view here. You can this is a short axis view. You can see the aorta, and then this is the left LAD, and there's an aneurysm in the LAD. Now, if the Kawasaki is diagnosed within 10 days and intravenous immunoglobulin 2 grams per kilo is given, then the incidence of aneurysms is lowered from 50% to 5%. So without IVIG, 50% chance of aneurysms. With IVIG, within 10 days, only 5% chance of aneurysm. By the time they have peeling of the fingers, it's too late. That's typically after 10 days, and if efficacy of IVIG is lost at that point. So therefore important to make the kind of presumptive diagnosis of Kawasaki in that first 10-day window and give them the IVIG. We can, by the way, give them IVIG here. 2 grams per kilo, given slow infusion over 20 hours. It's only if it's rapidly given, sometimes they get allergic reactions, but you just have to monitor them for that 24-hour period for the IVIG. This is another fever, body ache, low platelets, patient in shock. Physician thinking of
Dengue.
and dengue can affect the heart. You can get a low ejection fraction. You can actually get pericardial effusions. You can get sinus brady. You can have ST changes. So you can get a lot of cardiac changes in dengue. The good thing is that they all improve over time. So it's generally just supportive management, managing the EF and so on, and it improves.
Part of the
as time goes on.
polycerositis.
Pardon?
Part of the polycerositis.
Polycerositis, yes. So this one, sinus tachycardia, out of proportion to the degree of fever. Patient has quiet precordium, gallop rhythm, but just tachycardia. Fever 100, but tachycardia of 160, 180. One thing to suspect is myocarditis, because that's again something that can be very non-specific, can present with vomiting, can present with this kind of sinus stack, nothing much else. So the way to diagnose it is a quick echo, looking for the ventricular function. So if you see here, this is the LV, not pumping very well. You can look at your ECG, but really just a quick echo. If the echo is normal, that would typically rule out the myocarditis. If LV function was reduced, that would go along with myocarditis, and then we would treat it accordingly. So common causes of myocarditis, and one of the electrolytes to check if LV function is poor and they present like this would be calcium. But interestingly, even rheumatic can have LV dysfunction, enteric, all of these can present with enteric myocarditis, diphtheritic in the days before DPT, diphtheritic myocarditis and so on. Case 5, this is a 4-month-old, failure to thrive, sweating with feeds, tachypnea, classic heart failure symptoms. On exam, bounding pulses, active precordium, has a gallop, loud second heart sound, pulmonary hypertension, 2/6 systolic ejection murmur.
Tough.
So we're thinking of VSD, right? But more likely a PDA because of the bounding pulses. So if you've got heart failure symptoms and bounding pulses, then a patent ductus arteriosus. So this patient is sent for ECG, shows biventricular hypertrophy, X-ray shows cardiomegaly and plethora. So you're thinking, okay, this is right. Patient's got a large shunt. Goes to the echo, to the cardiologist, they do an echo, they show that LA, LV, left atrium, left ventricle are dilated, but they say no VSD seen, no PDA seen. And patient is sent home on Lasix, has to come back in 1 month. Lo and behold, it's an aortopulmonary window. So I actually reported a series in cardiology in the young of 50 cases of AP window that have been missed. So AP window can be missed. So typically they have features of heart failure, bounding pulses. You think it's a PDA, but the cardiologist says it's not. Then resend back, high short axis view to look. This is the aorta, this is the pulmonary artery, and there's a gap there. The most common cause of missed severe pulmonary hypertension shunts in kids. Very common, commonly missed, easily treated because this just needs a patch closure for complete correction. So
how did that patient do after that? For 1 month?
Well, they came back. Actually, this was one of my misses in my little younger days. But they came back because the symptoms persisted. So again, I looked at the echo and then I picked it up. So now, any kid with a shunt, you know, this is what we train our fellows to do. You got to go high, short axis, rule out an AP window before just saying there's no shunt. Because VSD may not be there, PDA may not be there, but this can be picked up. There are certain echo views to pick it up. The other thing we look for on echo is something called reversal of flow. So in the aorta, blood comes back from the descending aorta up and goes into the pulmonary artery. So there are clues. But I think the lesson is this, that if there's symptoms of heart failure, there's evidence of cardiomegaly plethora, but the echo is saying there's no shunt, it's important to re-look to kind of get another opinion or get another look, looking for a shunt until we find it. We've had similar cases, the weird cases of kind of aortopulmonary shunts from the descending aorta, a big vessel going into the lungs. Again, the echo, there's no VSD, no PDA. But on further looking, we find there is always a shunt when the features are there of heart failure and X-ray shows cardiomegaly plethora. So one has to keep looking for it. And this is a rapid fire last case spotter. This is a 4-chamber view of the heart. So this is a hydatid cyst of the heart. So that's why PD cardiology is interesting. You see everything in it. So that's initially I thought it was a tumor actually, but it's a classic hydatid cyst. You can get it even in the heart.
But it's very unusual.
Very unusual, very unusual. Reportable.
Liver and lung.
Liver and lungs.
Yeah, very unusual, but does happen. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much.